Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. My name's Andrew Lawton. It's so great to have you tuned into the podcast this week, folks. The nomination race is in full swing right now. You could argue it has been for a while, and I know this weekend there's going to be a big gathering of conservatives and people that think they're conservatives and people that don't even want to be conservatives but are pretending they're conservatives in Washington, well, not actually in Washington, D.C., in the National Harbor for CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference. I've been in previous years, not able to make it this year. I will say, though, this political season seems to be bringing a lot. We had the Manning Center Conference in Ottawa last week. We have this CPAC conference. There's the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party Convention, I think, this weekend as well. So lots is happening here. And then in a few months, we'll have in July the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio. And it is going to be a long road there. Super Tuesday this week, I think, changes things a little bit, yet not at all in the same way. I'm going to be talking about that in a few moments on this podcast. I'm also going to be chatting later on about something that's not directly political, but cultural and societal. And that is the breakdown of the family. What one author, a family physician and psychologist, calls the collapse of parenting. Parents giving their kids too much autonomy, too much independence, and why that's actually leading to more fragility in kids. Not to mention a lot of other behavioral and even health-related challenges. So we'll be talking about that later on in the show as well. Also going to be talking about some other things as well, like assisted dying. Margaret Wente from the Globe and Mail will join me to talk about why the process has really been one that has left more questions than answers. That's all coming up later on as well. But oh yeah, I can't not talk about Super Tuesday and, more importantly, where things are in the Republican primary specifically. The Democrat primary, and I include the caucuses in that as well, is important. But with poll numbers as well as superdelegates, it seems like we're headed towards a Hillary Clinton coronation now. And that's surprising, frankly. I honestly thought Bernie Sanders could pull it off. Things could still change, especially considering that DNC delegates at their convention are not bound in the same way that Republican convention delegates are. Democrats can pretty much vote for whoever they want to. Republicans have to, for the first ballot, for most states anyway, vote for the person who won the lion's share of the delegates in that particular area anyway. That being said, Republicans and conservatives and observers in Canada need to be prepared for a lot of different scenarios here. To be clear, I don't know if Donald Trump beats Bernie Sanders. I would venture a guess to say he doesn't. I think there is a chance that Donald Trump beats Hillary Clinton. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with Hillary Clinton. I also think Donald Trump will drive up voter turnout. I think he'll drive up people to vote against him, but more importantly, he'll bring out voters who have previously felt disenfranchised by the political process. And maybe these are people we don't want to be involved in the political process. I'm not making a statement in this particular context one way or another. I'm just saying I think that will happen. I have been unequivocal that I am not a fan of Donald Trump. I have my misgivings about him. At the same time, though, I also have to point to what is a lack of responsibility in many of the criticisms that have been leveled against him. And this is where I'm having to be ultimately someone in the middle here on a lot of these issues. Because my issues with Donald Trump, my questions about his ideological merit, about his policies, his platforms, these are things that have left me with a lack of clarity about him and with a lack of faith in him. Most of the people who seem to be leading the charge against him, however, are doing so not based on his actual policies. They're doing so based on the medium itself. People saying he's just as bad as Hitler. People saying he is a racist. people saying he is this and that. We can have debates about his policies. I don't think he's a racist based on not hearing what a question was that was posed to him in an interview about the KKK. This is one where even when I first read what had happened, and I read about the interview he did with Jake Tapper, where he said, we got to look into it more. I was like, wow, this is ridiculous. Donald Trump's terrible. He wouldn't condemn the KKK. And most of the media reports were giving me the same story. And then I actually watched the interview, and I looked at it in the broader context of that he had disavowed the KKK. He had disavowed the endorsement by David Duke. He has continued to do so since that incident. Trump says it was a problem with the earpiece. I don't know if that was the case. I've done those remote interviews before where you're sitting in a room and you're wearing an earpiece, and sometimes you have to just guess what the person said. You can't see them. You can only hear them, and sometimes not very well. Now, he still has to own it as a candidate. But it was a disingenuous story that Donald Trump refused to disavow the KKK when we see that he did it in other contexts and other venues. He didn't do it in that one particular interview. And then we look at the wall with Mexico. I think this is a flawed idea, not to have a wall there. I think it's a flawed idea that Mexico will pay for it. And then we look at the ban on Muslim immigration. I don't agree with that policy. I don't think it's racist or bigoted. I think it's unconstitutional. I also think that it's flawed because you can't tell by looking at someone what their religion is. You could say ban immigration from Muslim countries. That's not what he said. And he did qualify that policy, and this was one of the earlier ones in the campaign, by saying only until we figure out what's going on. The problem is that you can't write that into a law. You can't write until we figure out what's going on into a law. You have to set up a much more accurate measure. But I watched Donald Trump's victory speech, because that's basically what it was, delivered in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, on the night of Super Tuesday after he carried most of the states in Super Tuesday and by very large margins. And he gave a speech that I think lasted 30 minutes or so. And he didn't give anything of substance. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't really a pit bull. It was actually, for his standards, pretty darn boring. And then I listened to the questions the reporters asked him. Reporters asked him, Donald Trump, will you disavow the KKK? And he said, yes, again and again, I have. I will. Will I have to again? I hope not. I have disavowed it multiple times a day, every day. And then someone asked him about the wall to Mexico, a policy he's talked about for weeks, months now. And then someone asked him about Muslim immigration, a policy that, again, you may find disagreeable, but he has already answered and addressed and said all he has to say on it. And in that room of reporters, national media, political observers, TV, newspaper, radio, online, not one person asked him a question about new policy. Not one person asked him about the economy. Not one person asked him about anything of substance, nor did they ask him about anything that he has not already said. And as much as I have issues with what Donald Trump has said and done and his past as a Democrat, the fact that even his business success is not all what it's cracked out to be, even though I have my misgivings about him, I also look at the media here and they write about everything to do with the medium, but not the message. They aren't interested in his actual policies. They aren't interested in his actual platform. Now, to be clear, he's not laid out serious and comprehensive and concise platform items. He's spoken in a lot of ways in generalities and platitudes. He's spoken about themes, immigration, military, but not about actual tangible items. He's not talked about much with the economy. He's talked about how he doesn't like how things are. He's talked about China, but he hasn't talked about what he's going to do to fix it. And I've heard him say time and time again, America is going to have the biggest, best, most powerful, strongest military. He's made that pledge more times than I can count. Have I ever heard him say how he's going to do that? Absolutely not. So it's not that he's not as polished as the others that bothers me about him. It's that I feel he is all sizzle but no steak. I feel that he is one-dimensional. But then we get to one of the big questions that Republicans need to seriously start asking right now, which is what happens if and when he wins the nomination. A day or two before Super Tuesday, there was this hashtag that started going viral, Never Trump. That's the hashtag, Never Trump. And this has received a lot of support from all sorts of places. It's mostly a hashtag driven by conservatives and Republicans who are pledging to never vote for Donald Trump. And I think that is short-sighted. I think it's short-sighted, and here's why. We don't know what a Donald Trump presidency will look like. We know that a Bernie Sanders presidency will be an unmitigated disaster economically. We know that a Hillary Clinton presidency will be an unmitigated disaster economically, not to mention the national security issues with either of them. We know this because both of them have promised things, especially Sanders, that will bankrupt this country, that will do more harm than good. In a strange way, I don't think the devil you know is all that positive a school of thought to embrace here. With Donald Trump, let's face it, congressional oversight, the importance of the Senate, individual states are going to have a heck of a lot more that they need to do to play ball here. And you know what? A president like Donald Trump is probably what the founders of the country, what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they put in all of those checks and balances to decentralize the power of the United States. I like Marco Rubio. I have since the get-go. And you know, the only issue I've really had with him has been a weakness, or not a weakness, but a softness on immigration. And even then, he's done enough to distance himself from that. I like Ted Cruz also. And Ted Cruz has said it is important to unify behind a nominee that is not Donald Trump. But ultimately, when you look at Cruz and Rubio, it's a matter of which one's going to give. It's a matter of which one is going to support the other one, and neither wants to. Neither wants to. We know Ben Carson's probably going to be dropping out on Friday of this week at CPAC. He gave a statement on Wednesday saying as much without actually saying it, but saying he's going to be skipping the Thursday debate this week in Michigan, and also saying that he does not see a political way forward for his campaign, which is good because he's been nothing but a demagogue up to this point. He's great in theory, should probably run for the Senate. He never should have been a presidential candidate. As much as I like the guy, I think he's a genuinely good person. I think he had good things to say. He was not cut out for this, especially in a race that is already crowded at this point in the game. But let's look at the actual numbers here. Now, the Saturday of this week, so this weekend, we have a few more primaries. But after Super Tuesday, Donald Trump is at 316 delegates. Ted Cruz, 226. Marco Rubio, 106. It's still anyone's game. Donald Trump still has 1/4 of the delegates, a little over 1/4 of the delegates that he needs to secure the nomination. Marco Rubio has Florida coming up. Michigan's coming up, which will be a big one as well. Now, it's looking like Donald Trump will take Michigan, but you never know, especially with a debate there this week. Conversely, you look at the Democrats, Hillary Clinton's at 577, Bernie Sanders at 386, but most of those superdelegates probably going to go to Hillary Clinton. Now, I haven't actually confirmed this, but I believe that Monica Lewinsky is endorsing Bernie Sanders. I believe the last Clinton presidency left a very bad taste in her mouth. But at the same time, I also think there's something to be said about why should America choose Hillary Clinton when even Bill Clinton can't choose Hillary Clinton, or won't anyway. These are the questions, people. Come on. No other media source is going to ask the tough questions of these candidates, of this process. Here's what we know about Donald Trump's campaign. He wouldn't sign the TPP. He would renegotiate NAFTA. Now, that's disastrous. And we've heard a lot of things that have gone perilously close to protectionism from him. Like, for example, he said on Tuesday that he was going to make Apple manufacture their products in the United States rather than in China. And look, as much as I agree that these sorts of decisions by companies have resulted in job losses, I don't think it's the government's right to order a company to do anything, because then a company's going to say, hey, you know what, we're going to headquarter elsewhere. Similarly, any politician that doesn't value NAFTA, especially as Canadians, this is where we can get involved, is very concerning. He also wants to designate China a currency manipulator. He wants to pursue a World Trade Organization case on Chinese government programs that subsidize exporters. He's getting into trying to manage China's internal issues. Don't deal with them. Make America more competitive. Make America a more competitive country by lowering taxes. Now, in fairness to the Donald, he has offered some suggestions as to how that would happen. He's talked about simplifying taxes. He's talked about even cutting corporate taxes. He's also, however, talked in the past about how a progressive income tax is important. He said on the record in a past interview that he thinks it's important that the rich need to pay their fair share. And ultimately, this is where Carly Fiorina had so much to offer in this race when she came out and said, look, the tax code can be simplified to one page. Other candidates have said similar things as well. I'm actually a big Huckabee fan for this reason because he talked about implementing the fair tax, which is even better than a flat tax because it abolishes income tax altogether and makes the country implement a national consumption tax. I've always been a supporter of that. In fact, I wish Canadians would see something like that as well as a possible way forward. I just know that no Canadians are ever doing anything as far as radical changes go. And we're looking at the immigration policies. And I, by the way, can't deny that people in the states that are hardest hit by illegal immigration are the most likely to swing towards Donald Trump. He's won those states by huge margins. And he's talking about these issues in a way that is more forceful than any other politician that's ever talked about immigration in the past. And for that reason, I have to say good for him. He's found his niche and he's following it through. But you have to have more to the process than that. Not allowing refugees from Syria, for example, I think is a short-sighted project. We can talk about the merits of humanitarian programs, of bringing in refugees. I'm a firm believer that countries, I think, have a moral obligation, not a legal obligation, a moral obligation to allow refugees. If you are a freedom-loving country, this is something you can do. And something you should do. That should never compromise national security. People should never be brought in under the auspices of what the Liberal government did, which is putting the number and deadline first, and then the resettlement. But his ban on Muslims, temporary ban, but yes, his ban on Muslims is short-sighted. And also saying no one from Syria is short-sighted as well. Well, how many other countries are you going to do that with? Why not just say, hey, we don't want to be a country that helps with refugees? But what benefit is it to be a freedom-loving nation if you are not prepared to share that freedom with others? If you are not prepared to be a country that says, hey, we want others to have a crack at this as well? Especially when so many, even in this particular race, you have Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, two people, both the children of immigrants, who are a stone's throw away from the highest office in the land, from one of the most important roles in the world. Immigration is important. And supporters of Trump will say, oh, well, he's anti-illegal immigration. He's not anti-immigration. Yeah, but at the same time, a lot of his policies are basically saying, you know what, we just don't want to deal with the hassle at all. We don't want to deal with it at all. So for Marco Rubio, who in the last week especially, but the last couple of weeks has really started to be a lot more negative. He started to attack Trump. I have to wonder whether it's working. I mean, he won his first state on Super Tuesday, Minnesota. And Minnesota's a good one to have. It's not like he won Maine or something with its, paltry 26, I think, electoral college votes or something like that. And he got 37 delegates out of it, bringing his count up to 106. Now, as Donald Trump has noted himself, if all the states that Trump won were winner-take-all states, this whole race would be locked up. So I don't think anything's slowing down here. And it's not even like John Kasich and Ben Carson are pulling in big enough numbers that at the convention, if there is a second round of balloting, they'll actually have a substantial impact. They won't. Even if Kasich drops out and Carson drops out this weekend, they're having between the two of them, I think, 33 delegates. Whoop-de-doo. Doesn't really amount to a hill of beans in the grand scheme of things. So where do we go from here? Should conservatives fall in line behind a Donald Trump candidacy, or is this a grin and bear it election to vote for the Democrats? I cannot fathom the latter option being the right one. I've heard some analysts, though, and obviously you have to take a grain of salt alongside these analyst and pundit predictions, that have said not only is there the possibility of a third-party candidacy here, but even a fourth-party candidacy. There's that Michael Bloomberg prospect that's been looming over people. There's also a question of whether or not some Republican is going to come in who doesn't have a sense of future for themselves, because you're committing career suicide if you basically run against a Republican nominee as a Republican or as an independent conservative, rather. But I'm afraid that you get someone like Lindsey Graham, who doesn't really seem to care that much, that says, hey, I'm going to run as a third-party guy. Or heck, someone who wants to be in there just as a spoiler. And if that's the case, you get a guy like Bloomberg coming in, siphoning votes off of the left. The fact of the matter is, we're dealing with an election here in which truly anything can happen. I don't think that Aaron Sorkin could have written, if he were writing the script for reality right now, a better outcome, or a better process at least. You know, I watched The West Wing. I like The West Wing a lot. And in the 6th season, they focused on the nomination for the Republicans and the Democrats. And in the 7th season, they focused on a general election. Seasons 6 and 7 of West Wing were my favorite of that show because I liked seeing that part of it. I liked seeing a different dimension. It was less about governing and more about the politics. And my goodness, I thought that was an exciting campaign. I thought that was an exciting nomination race. That is nothing near what the GOP race is in this particular election, in the 2016 election. And that was, I think, 6 years ago that show went off the air, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, yeah, that was great at the time. Reality is far more interesting right now. And I'm very curious what all of these never-Trump conservatives are actually going to do. And I'm not condemning them. You know what? If you've got your principles, you genuinely think he's bad for the party, I think he's bad for the party. I think with him, I'm actually grateful for the Americans that they have the option to vote for different parties at different levels of government. And this is something that I wish we had in Canada, and I know it's not part of our system. I know it's not a viable alternative without having a massive overhaul of our system of government, but I would love to have the opportunity to vote for a local MP or MPP or MLA and a party leader. And this is what they have, and maybe have them different parties. Because I think there are going to be a lot of Republicans that are voting for Republican governors, senators, congressmen, etc., and then voting as a write-in, or voting for no one, or voting for an independent, or even voting for a Democrat, heaven forbid, at the presidential level. I don't imagine that will be too uncommon a sight come November. I really want to hear what you think about this, because I know there are a lot of Trump supporters right now that are listening and probably outraged about this, and that's fine. I don't care. I really don't care. This is about discussion and debate. That's why I like having the platform of The Rebel. There isn't just one homogenous view of what a conservative is. We can disagree on these things. I think that's fine. I think that's necessary. But I'm really concerned. I should say less so that this is happening in the U.S., because A, it doesn't affect me directly, and B, and this is, I think, the important part as well, is that they have a mechanism where their party basically rebuilds from the ground up every 4 years anyway. So nothing is irreparable. Here's what I want to leave you with, though, before I end this segment. Donald Trump is the anti-politician. He's the least politician-like politician that the country has ever seen. And that's endearing to people. That's charming to people. He's seen as anti-establishment to the nth degree. But let me make one point very clear here. So were Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. These were both Tea Party guys. Let's not forget that today's rebel is tomorrow's establishment. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, these guys are senators because of the Tea Party movement. They were the ones that people said are better than the establishment. And the fact that people have now said, oh, no, these are just establishment guys. Well, yeah, by definition, when you're a senator, I guess that makes you part of the establishment. But this is a political equivalent of the grass is always greener on the other side, and I think it's going to backfire. Let me know what you think. Andrew at andrewlawton.ca is my email address. You're listening to Lawton Online here on the rebel.media. We'll be right back in just a couple of moments, folks. Stay with us.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on the rebel.media.
We are back here on Lawton Online on the rebel.media. I wanted to move from politicians behaving like children to actual, literal, physical children here for a moment, because I was actually researching the other week a really interesting and convoluted thing. I won't bore you with that, but I was doing some research, and you know how sometimes when you go down that rabbit hole on the internet, you can click something and that leads you to somewhere, and you click to somewhere else, and you go through this weird, like 19 degrees of separation sort of thing, and end up on something really interesting and different. Well, that was the case here. And I ended up researching gender differences. And I came across the work of a Dr. Leonard Sachs, and I was really interested in what I found. I was really appreciative of what I found. So I was like, I want to learn a little bit more about this guy, see what else he's written. And as it so happened, Dr. Leonard Sachs had actually written a book just in December that had come out on the disintegration of the parent-child bond. That was basically the academic way of talking about his research. And I read this and I was like, you know what, I want to talk to this guy. I want to interview this guy. And the book was recent enough that I reached out to him, and much to my happiness, he was available to come on and chat. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the book and the work in a few moments, but it's called The Collapse of Parenting. And I think it's a really interesting one, but like with anything, I'm more intrigued by the subtitle of the book than by the actual title of the book itself. And I was anyway when I first got a copy. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm loving what I've read so far. It's called The Collapse of Parenting: How We Hurt Our Kids When We Treat Them Like Grown-Ups. And he talks about the fact that not only does treating kids like grown-ups just not make sense, because kids aren't able to make certain decisions that adults are trying to give them or trying to let them make. But more importantly, he says from the actual research, when this happens, and we'll go over some specific examples shortly, it leads not only to greater instances of social isolation, but also physical illness, things like obesity, and general fragility. And I think any longtime listener to this program knows what happens when kids are raised into a fragile state, because we're seeing the byproducts of people's fragility being codified into these so-called human rights laws. So let's go to ground zero of it. How is this happening? I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Leonard Sachs to the program. Not only is he the author of this book, but he's also both a psychologist with a PhD as well as a family physician. So he's going after both sides of this issue. Dr. Sachs, really great to talk to you, sir. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks for inviting me.
So you've obviously having a very unique perspective here as both a family doctor and a psychologist. You've seen families interact here. What was it that really got you looking at this issue? Because I know you've written a lot on other sort of issues about upbringing and gender differences, et cetera. Why this one?
Well, it's just something that I see in the office every day. Mom brings in her 6-year-old with a fever and sore throat. And I look at the ears, which are fine, and then I say, okay, now we need to do a strep test. And as I'm approaching the child, Mom says, is it okay if the doctor looks at your throat? And then we'll go for ice cream. And the daughter looks at her mom and considers the question and then says, no, I don't think so. And what should have been a quick 10-second maneuver is now a 5-minute ordeal requiring an assistant to restrain the child, who is screaming with anger because she feels that the world is unjust. Her mother posed a question. she gave an answer, and her answer is being ignored. Look, there are some domains in which it's okay to let kids decide, but this is not one of them. When a child has a fever and a sore throat, and they come to the doctor's office, they're going to get a strep test. The child does not get a vote. Mom thinks she's doing the kind and enlightened thing, but she's not. She is being unhelpful.
And the situation we really see there is one that, I mean, from a medical perspective is concerning enough because the mom's making something optional that you as a physician know is necessary. But when we see this in other areas, we're really shining a light on a problem that kids don't really have that ability to fully understand those decisions at that age. Same as other life decisions. I mean, when parents start basically boiling it down to bargaining, they're missing out on the fact that there's a bigger purpose at stake there.
Well, there are many decisions that I find parents in Canada, parents in the United States are letting kids decide where it's really should not be the kid's decision. One is, are you going to let your kid take their phone to bed with them? That should not be a decision you put in the hands of your child or teenager. What is your 14-year-old supposed to say tomorrow in school when her friend says, hey, I texted you last night at midnight, how come you didn't answer? Is she really supposed to say, well, researchers have found that sleep deprivation in adolescents increases the risk of depression, so I turned my phone off? Come on, that's ridiculous. That's not the way teenagers talk. You have to allow the teenager to say, hey, my evil parents take my phone every night, and I don't know whether they have it back till the next morning. At 9 o'clock at night, you, the parent, take the phone and switch it off and put it in the charger, which stays in the parent's bedroom. This has to be the parent's decision. It's not appropriate to let the kid decide.
Is this coming from parents wanting to be their child's friend, from parents not wanting to be seen as unpopular, to be seen as mean, or is there another cause of this that you've identified?
Well, I think the deeper cause is that parents are really uncertain, many parents, about what is their role. And many parents feel like their priority is to have their child be happy and have a good time. And they haven't really thought carefully about this. They're just trying to maximize their kids' happiness on a day-to-day basis, and the result is a lot of boys spending 3 hours a day playing video games and a lot of girls spending 3 hours a day on Instagram and Facebook. It's the parent's job, as I say in the book, to educate desire, to help your child to want something that's bigger and deeper and more meaningful than video games and social media.
At what age does that really need to start? Because in a lot of cases, I think when parents seem to be cluing into the fact that this problem exists, it's already because that technology addiction, social media, video games is really already manifesting itself in teenagers.
Well, it needs to start real early. It needs to start in infancy and toddlerhood. And I see many parents of 4-year-olds who are driving their kids around from one play date to another. And I tell those parents, cancel the play date and make a family date instead. It's way more important that your child bond with you than it is that they bond with other 4-year-olds. And again, this is news to many parents, but there's so much good evidence supporting that point.
That's actually counterintuitive to what I would have assumed, because I thought when you're dealing with issues like bullying, social isolation, it would be better to be surrounded by peers rather than just parents. Why is that not actually the case in practice?
Canadian psychologist Dr. Gordon Neufeld has been practicing for 40 years and wrote a wonderful book called Hold On to Your Kids. And I met with him face-to-face, and we talked about some of these issues during the writing of the book. And he really has a good handle on this. Look, there have always been mean kids. There have always been bullies. But the bullying seems to be having more an effect now than it did 30 years ago. And again, there's good data to support this. 30 years ago, it was very rare for a child to commit suicide because of bullying. Now it's become more common. Why is that? And Dr. Neufeld, I think, really has the answer, and I quote from him very extensively in my book. And I put it in more of an American perspective, drawing on American data as well as Canadian data. An American sociologist, Dr. Joseph Coleman, 50 years ago, interviewed teenagers across the United States and asked them, if all your friends wanted you to join a particular club, but one of your parents did not approve, would you still join? And 50 years ago, most American teenagers said no, they would not join because the good regard of their parents counted more than the combined opinion of all their peers. I posed a similar question to teenagers across Canada and the United States at dozens of venues between 2008 and 2015, an updated question. I asked them, if all your friends wanted you to join a particular social media site, would you consult your parents before you joined? And the most common answer I get is laughter. The kids will burst out laughing. As one girl said, my parents probably think Ask FM is some kind of radio station. Why would I bother asking them? So as Dr. Neufeld observed, there's been a real shift from a culture in which kids cared what their parents thought above what their peers thought to contemporary culture in which Canadian and American teens care much more about what their peers think than they do about what their parents think. And that's the answer to your question. If you are grounded in the unconditional love of your parents, and if that's the most important thing in your life, then if the kids are being mean at school, you know what? It's not such a big deal. It doesn't rock your world. But if the regard of your peers is the most important thing in your life, it's how you define yourself, then if the kids at school are being mean, who are you? You're nobody. Your life is worthless. And this change in perspective has created this incredible explosion in fragility among Canadian and American kids, because the regard of your peers, if you're 12 years old or 15-year-olds, the regard of your peers is contingent and ephemeral. It can change in a day. It can change in an hour. It can change in a minute over nothing, over the way you dress, over a comment you make. And kids know this, and so they are anxious, on edge, checking their phone every 5 minutes. God forbid that someone sends them a text that they don't promptly respond, because the regard of their peers is the most important thing.
But we're seeing that in adults now, too, which is even concerning, that people don't seem to be outgrowing that mentality.
Well, I do hear from a lot of teens when I talk to them about the dangers of social media and video games. One kid said to me, as I was presenting to them the dangers of some of these violent video games like Grand Theft Auto, one boy said to me, well, my father stays up till 2 a.m. playing Grand Theft Auto, and that's a real concern. You cannot teach a virtue to your children if you yourself do not possess or strive for that virtue. And so I do have a concern about some of the parents I hear about.
I wanted to go back to younger children here, and a theme we started off on in the interview, which is basically parents telling their kids, look, you need to do this, instead of letting kids make these decisions and be independent on some areas. Is there a way to go too far with that, though? Because we've seen issues as well with parents just bubble wrapping kids, and that seems to lead to a greater fragility as well.
Well, sure. And it all depends on the situation and the question, and many parents who don't want to see their kids fail. And as I stress, failure is part of life, and it's essential to allow kids to fail. But no, the points I'm talking about are having to do with addiction to social media and screens and video games. And there, I do think parents need to limit and govern and guide their kids' use of screens, because the contemporary culture, for many Anglophone kids, if you're a boy, you raise your popularity by finishing all the missions in Call of Duty. If you're a girl, you raise your prestige by having 5,000 followers on Instagram. And the fastest way to get 5,000 followers on Instagram, if you're a girl, is to post some sexy pictures of you in your bikini.
Yeah.
And a lot of parents have no idea their daughter's even doing this. So there's a lot of toxic things going on in contemporary Anglophone culture, by which I mean the culture of Justin Bieber and Miley Cyrus. And parents need to be aware of this and need to be on top of it.
And I guess the big question then for a lot of parents is, how can they be expected to monitor this if they don't even understand the technology? I mean, do you need to have a degree in computer studies here to deal with rectifying these relationships if kids do have these entire immersions in this digital subculture?
Well, again, I do mention some specific programs in the book, like Net Nanny Mobile and My Mobile Watchdog, so that you know what your kids are doing online, and the programs are written for clueless middle-aged people, and explain, look, this app that you thought was a calculator app, your kid is spending 3 hours a day on this app uploading photos. It's actually just looks like a calculator. You enter a passcode, and it's actually a photo sharing site that kids are sharing sexy photos with one another. And these programs make that very easy. But more importantly is to turn off the devices and to bring family together. Look, in many Canadian families and in many American families, mother, father, son, and daughter come home, and within minutes they're each is in a different room looking at a different screen. And I tell parents, ban the bedroom. The bedroom is for sleeping. When they come home, everyone should be together in a common room, like the living room or the kitchen. You don't have to be talking with one another, but how can you have a family life if you're never together as a family, if everyone's in their own room with the door closed looking at a screen?
Fascinating research in this. The Collapse of Parenting is the name of the book, How We Hurt Our Kids When We Treat Them Like Grown-Ups. The author, Dr. Leonard Sachs, joining me on the line. Dr. Sachs, really great interview and book. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thanks for inviting me.
I've spoken on past shows to Lenore Skenazy, author of the book Free Range Kids, and she talks about how parents need to, like I alluded to in the last question to Dr. Sachs there, or the second last, whichever it was, how parents need to stop bubble wrapping their kids, how we should let kids go for walks. She talks about how stranger danger is more of this item of mythology, not a real threat, that there's a rapist or predator or child abductor or dangers, hazards looming around every corner. And when I first read about this book, I was wondering, okay, is he talking about parents shouldn't let their kids do that? No, he's not talking about that at all. He's talking about the decision-making process. Yeah, you need to let kids fail. You need to let kids learn lessons the hard way, but don't reason with them like they are actual adults. Don't try to negotiate and bargain with them. In some cases, the only evidence you need to back up your point is that you're the parent, they're not. You're the one that gets to call the shots. You're the one that gets to tell them what to do. They're not the one that gets you to say no. And when you're dealing with teenagers, it's even more so. I mean, you have parents that I think shrug their shoulders. Maybe they don't want to deal with the hassle of it. Now, I don't have kids, so I'm not on the front lines of this. But I've seen it in other people. I've seen the kids that are raised in this particular environment, and I've seen the parents that are overly permissive, starting from a young age and even going up to adulthood. And when you look at sort of that connection with technology, it's interesting how we've seen it unfold there. Now, one point we didn't get to in the interview, and I still think it's one that is worth discussing and worth trying to delve into a little bit more here, is figuring out whether technology is a byproduct of, in this particular case, a change that's already existing in culture, or whether technology, connectivity, social media has been the force driving it. And it could entirely be one of these chicken-egg situations, where you can't really blame one. You have to accept that, these are all part and parcel of different interconnected issues. But either way, it's fascinating. From what I've read so far, I would definitely encourage people to pick up the book. It's called The Collapse of Parenting. And I actually wanted to read very briefly here a couple of excerpts from a piece that Dr. Sachs had in the Globe and Mail in January. He wrote an op-ed about this. And he said, peer relations are fragile by nature. Emily and Melissa, fictitious characters in this respect, may be best friends, but both of them know that one wrong word might fracture their relationship beyond repair. And that's one reason why Emily is so frantic about checking her text messages every 5 minutes. If Melissa sends a text and Emily does not promptly respond, Emily is afraid that Melissa may interpret her silence as indicating a lack of enthusiasm. In peer relations, everything is conditional and contingent. Young people don't want to look incompetent in the eyes of their peers, not for a week, not even for a single day. I would add, not even for a moment. So many will not risk a humbling experience. Children and teenagers need unconditional love and acceptance today, no less than they did 30 or 50 years ago. But they cannot get it from their peers or from a report card. And that's one reason why there has been an explosion in the prevalence of anxiety and depression, unquote. Kind of interesting. And that isn't to say that tough love isn't important, but parents need to be that fixture in their child's life. So when you have parents that are checking out, thinking, well, the kids are isolating in the rooms, I'm sure they're fine. It's that whole thing, no noise, they're, I guess, on their own, I guess they're fine, everything's good. And look, I was raised, I never had like a computer in the room, obviously different generation than that. But now that seems to be the norm. So yeah, you can hold away. And I say this as someone who, by the way, loves holding myself away. But when I was younger, I needed someone to tell me, no, Andrew, you can't do that. In any case, as always, let me know what you think. Andrew at andrewlawton.ca is my email address, or you can tweet me at Andrew Lawton. We'll be right back in just a couple of moments with more Lawton Online. You're tuned into the rebel.media. Stay tuned, Canada.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on the rebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using at Andrew Lawton.
We are back here on the program. I'm going to take a bit of a deeper tone to a lot of segments on this show, and this particular one here, because this is an issue where I have a sense of personal experience here that can impact this discussion. Now, many of you may know this, many of you may not. If you don't know it, well, yeah, it might shock you a bit, but it's out in the open. I talk about this a lot of the time. I'm a survivor of a suicide attempt. I've dealt much of my life with mental illness. I'm fine now and have been for several years, but back in 2010, despite the fact that I was working in media, despite the fact that things in my career were going well, I had a decent personal life, I was still dealing with depression and attempted suicide, and nearly succeeded, as a matter of fact. I was in the hospital for about 7 weeks. I was in a coma for much of it, and during that time, no one knew except for close family, not even friends, why I was actually there. And I kept that to myself for quite a while after leaving the hospital. And then finally made a decision to talk about it, because I wanted to bring awareness around to this issue and share my experiences. And I try to share my experiences in this respect whenever I feel it applies to stories at hand, because it helps give me a sense of context. And you know what the left loves to do? The left loves to say, oh, you have to check your privilege. You can't talk about this. Well, I'm like, hey, I tried to kill myself, mofos. I can talk about this. You check your privilege. I've only had to do that a couple times. But one really fascinating and very scary point that was raised in a column this week by Margaret Wente of the Globe and Mail was that under Canada's new framework, the proposed framework for legal assisted dying, people who have mental illness may in fact be eligible for a state-sanctioned, government-funded, physician-assisted suicide. Why? Because no exclusion for that particular group has been made thus far. Now, this is not entirely unprecedented, by the way. In Belgium, a country with legalized assisted suicide, mentally ill people are eligible. There was actually a case just about, I think it was a year or two ago, where a young British woman, I think she was in her early 20s, maybe even her late teens, was actually wanting to go, and she may, for all I know, have actually done it. Her name was protected under a publication ban. She wanted to get assisted suicide because of her depression. The criteria for state-sanctioned assisted death is your disease has to be grievous and incurable. And anyone who's ever dealt with mental illness could tell you that it is grievous, and in some cases, it is in fact incurable. But the problem is that those are not the only criteria that should be applied to this situation. There is a lot of complexity. And even though most Canadians, I think, by and large, are supportive of legalized assisted suicide, not all, but most, there are still a lot of questions about how we as a country should do that and should allow that to happen. And those questions aren't really being answered by the government here. In fact, in a lot of cases, the questions don't even seem to be being asked by the government. When the Supreme Court ruled on this under the previous Conservative government, it gave a deadline. That deadline is approaching in June. In June, it will be the law of the land that assisted suicide is legal. The government has spent a matter of weeks to try to deal with issues that took Quebec and Oregon and other countries years. And even experts that have been brought in from those regions to talk about this have said, I don't think this is on the right track right now. And this is what happens when you try to ram through massive legislation rooted in conscience that is quite literally a matter of life and death in just a few months. The Supreme Court's been part of the problem here because they gave a very short time frame and wouldn't allow the government to extend it. But the government's also part of the problem for not pushing harder to keep a very narrow set of parameters for when assisted suicide should be valid. I wanted to talk a little bit about the mental illness component because I think this highlights the broader issues and, more importantly, the broader red flags over this discussion. So I'm very pleased to welcome Globe and Mail columnist Margaret Wente to the program. Wrote a phenomenal piece about this week. Margaret, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi.
So one big thing that you've pointed out in the piece here more broadly is that this has been really an issue that has been just rammed through the process here. We had the Supreme Court decision that was made under the last government, and then obviously while dealing with the transition, this is something that has basically had to be thrust in a very abbreviated timeline. So a lot of these questions really haven't even been asked, let alone answered.
They're not even on the table. And when I ask friends of mine, just casually ask them, do you have any idea that mental illness might qualify people to seek assisted suicide? They say they're horrified. They're horrified. They say, oh my God, that can't possibly be. Because most of us, when we think of the right to die, we think of somebody in the terminal stages of cancer, for example. Almost at the end of life, wants to avoid the last chapter of pain and suffering. That is the law that they have in Quebec. And that's the law that almost everybody thinks we're going to get. But in fact, the law that we are going to get could be far, far broader than that. And most people are shocked when they hear that.
Including even some of the people that have been involved in the process from an expert perspective here. You mentioned one physician, Dr. Linda Ganzini of Oregon, which is obviously a state that has embraced legalized assisted dying, and you've said that she told the panel that interviewed her that she was dumbfounded that this was a consideration because in Oregon, when they spent absolutely a huge lengths of time on this, I think years, if I'm not mistaken, on their own laws, one thing that was done is specifically excluding this.
That's right. They have a very narrow law. And so, we need to talk about this. We really need to talk about it. The problem is that we're rushing towards this date, which is now in early June, when the right to die will be the law of the land, according to the Supreme Court. And we don't even have any laws in place to figure out what we're doing. That's the shocking part.
Obviously, things have to be done in a certain period of time when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, but I'm wondering here what it says that there doesn't seem to be an appreciation by the Supreme Court of the complexity of this issue.
Well, the Supreme Court, in fact, wrote a decision that many legal experts can't even agree on what the decision means. Some will argue that, yes, obviously, the scope is broad enough to include people with mental illness, and some argue, obviously, the scope is not broad enough to include people with mental illness. So it just depends on which expert you ask. We can't even agree on the basics. At least the experts can't.
Yeah, and that was true, and you mentioned this in your column, that one psychiatry professor who's also a research chair in palliative care in Manitoba, he said that the parliamentary report goes actually beyond what the Supreme Court even said. So you're right, there seems to be some very concerning contradictions depending on who you ask about what the actual decision was.
Oh, yeah. Well, they kind of left it wide open. But there are tons and tons of things to argue about. For example, should we keep it to people who are terminally ill and at the end of life, which is what they're doing in Quebec, or should we expand it to anybody who just has who says they have unbearable suffering, even if they may have years and years to live and they have a chronic condition that isn't fatal? We haven't yet talked about children, minors.
Yeah.
People under 18 who may be competent to make their own decisions. And but some people even think that this law should extend to smaller children who can't make their own decisions, but should be relieved of the pain and suffering just as we would give the right to adults to. So it's just a mess.
Yeah, and we have, as you mentioned earlier on in the segment here, people, when they sort of envision in their minds what assisted dying is, they picture, the 65-year-old woman or man at the end of their life dealing with ALS or terminal cancer, etc., who is basically defiantly saying, you know what, I want to go out on my own terms. I want to basically go out while I can still make this decision. And while those are certainly the cases that I think have led public opinion to sway the direction it has, they don't represent the totality of this. There have been, as I mentioned in my intro, cases in Europe where you've had young people, teenagers, people in their early 20s that aren't in that boat, that are dealing with depression. And you've cited here that in Belgium, they have euthanized people that were dealing with things, even eating disorders, which are certainly serious mental illnesses, need to be treated, but not something that I think really justifies ending your life over.
No, we've got to talk. People have been in Belgium and the Netherlands, which have a very expansive version of the right to die law. People have requested death because they're autistic and they have a terrible life and they can't cope and they have no social life and so on, and have been accepted for death. So people think, no, the slippery slope arguments are exaggerated, but if you look at those places, you would say, no, they're not exaggerated, and we better sort all this stuff out before we go ahead here. Why can't we proceed incrementally, introduce a law that's narrow, like the Quebec law, for example, which is very narrow, the Oregon law, which is very narrow, and say, all right, let's just see how this goes. Let's go slow. But instead, we're sort of rushing pell-mell towards a cliff. Well, most people really haven't had a chance to absorb what's going on.
When we have systems like Quebec, like Oregon, why are we not just modeling our system more directly after that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel here, which is basically how it's looking like the committee is doing or trying to? Well,
it's partly because the right to die lobby is extremely strong and extremely vocal and extremely active. And it's partly because some people argue that they argue that equal rights, that the mentally ill should have the same right to death as the physically ill, which of course begs the question of the extent to which the mental illness may impair judgment and competency. Also begs the question of whether we should be euthanizing people who might have a chance to get better if they were to live. My email is full of arguments that say, yes, we should extend equal rights to mentally ill people, but that becomes a very, very tricky, subjective matter, and it also calls into question the role of mental health professionals whose job is actually to offer hope, not to offer sort of the solution that happens to be death.
And also, the fact that your email inbox is filled with people saying that means that there's a discussion that needs to be had there, but we can't just basically stumble into this system where that's acceptable without having a comprehensive analysis of both sides of it, which seems to be happening more because of your column than by anything Parliament's doing.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly it. I don't know, how thoroughly Parliament is going to debate this. My God, I certainly hope they do have a thorough debate and that there is no whipped vote over this issue, which I think would be absolutely appalling. But, I think many of us, especially those who have had, close connections with people with serious psychological disabilities, not to get too personal about this, but I have a relative who's been struggling with serious psychological disabilities for a long time. And one symptom of her disability is that for long periods of time in her life, she's wished that she was dead.
Wow.
And, I think that I'm pretty sure that if a law like this had been in place, she would have strenuously applied to be accepted. And she wouldn't be alive today. In fact, she is alive today, thank God. And she's better. She's not perfect. But, she doesn't want to die these days. And that's a good thing. I'm kind of glad she's still around.
Yeah, as am I. And it speaks to the fact that what seems incurable or irreparable at one point in your life with mental illness, by the virtue of it being what it is, can in fact change. So I'm very glad that things are moving in a better direction for her. I really appreciate the thought you have put into this. Margaret Wente joining me on the line, Globe and Mail columnist. Always a pleasure, Margaret.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for extending the discussion. It's really important.
Yeah, I agree completely. Andrew Coyne in the National Post, and by the way, I don't often agree. Well, I shouldn't say don't often. I don't always agree with Andrew Coyne. And that's what makes him a good columnist, is that you truly never know which side of an issue he's going to come down on. But he had a piece about this that I thought was actually really well measured and really reasonable. And one thing that he said here is that we've lost sight of some of the major themes of this. We've lost sight of this, and there was a question that he posed even in the headline. He said, Canada is making suicide a public service. Have we lost our way as a society? That was a question, and you know what? I think that's a very valid question. I support legalized assisted suicide. The reason is not rooted in anything other than the fact that I think you have rights to your own body and rights to your own life when you are of sound mind. Suicide is not a crime in Canada. Anyone can pick up a tool of their choice and end their life if they so choose. That doesn't mean the state doesn't have mechanisms to intervene, but that is, by extension, part of your right to life, your right to end your life. And I realize this brings us to very concerning moral territory. For example, doctors have to vow, first, do no harm. Is it more harmful to end a life, or is it more harmful to allow someone to live a life of pain and suffering? I'm not answering the question right now. But that is, in fact, a question that needs to be addressed here. Is assisted suicide something that paves a road for euthanasia? Ending a life of someone who is not consenting, who is not seeking it? How do you fulfill someone's right, but at the same time having strict enough parameters that the system is not abused? That death-happy doctors are not killing people or allowing patients to kill themselves when maybe they aren't incurable. You know, my own experience with mental illness has taught me in the course of this that what I thought at one time was incurable, irreparable, and would never be fixed, that I thought could never change, did. And I'm sitting here today as a testament to the fact that what I would have bet any amount of money, and in fact tried to bet my entire life on 5.5 years ago, is today not true. I did see the light. I am in a better place. Not everyone's going to be as fortunate. Not everyone is going to be able to rebound, to recover. Some people's battles with mental illness are a heck of a lot worse than mine was. But things do change. Things do change. And what Andrew Coyne writes here is that, quote, the Supreme Court not only opened the door to assisted suicide, but it opened it a little wider than it had been asked to, unquote. And he talked about the fact that the court's decision did not, and Margaret Wente talked about this as well, spare patients from the cruel choice of killing themselves when they were able or enduring pain and dignity. He said the court didn't really require that dilemma to be there. In fact, all the court seemed to say in its decision was that it was enough for you to have some form of illness. It was enough for you to think, or for doctors to think, that that was not going to be fixed, that it was not going to be cured. And beyond that, that you wanted help. The necessity of assistance wasn't even really an issue. It wasn't that you couldn't do it. It wasn't that you didn't have the means available. It was basically just saying, hey, yeah, why not? And we will then have, similarly to our abortion laws, by the way, among the most broadest and widest applicable laws on this issue in the world, if this goes ahead as it's looking like it now. And again, this is not for a lack of a resolution. This is for lack of even people trying to understand all of these circumstances. The government is definitely failing Canadians on this one. And on that happy, cheery note, folks, I got to wrap things up for the podcast for today. But don't worry, we'll be back next week with more Lawton Online on the rebel.media. My thanks to my guests and, of course, the listeners of this program. I'm Andrew Lawton. We'll talk to you next week, Canada.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out the rebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.